You have to have visionaries, you know, you have to have people that will think outside of the norm.
We have to be given the power to tell our own stories.
We all want to say our piece. This is a crazy time.
What they care about is what it means to them.
You have to not think like society thinks.
This is a fight about power. Who has it and who has the right to use it?
We're having a reckoning about what public safety can, should, and must look like.
It's about a broader question of representation, who gets to create the images and define how we see the world.
They want their voice to be heard, they have to get involved.
Finally, we get to tell our truth and tell our stories like our stories matter.
What's going to bring people together is equality.
The love that we have for each other is the shortcut to true human happiness.
You start to see how it's all connected.
Every single person around the world can create a movement.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Goldberg. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and I want to welcome you to the second week of the Atlantic Festival. Our magazine was founded 164 years ago to, among other things, illuminate the American idea. Our founders, people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. To be a founder of The Atlantic, you had to have a complicated three-part name. Our founders played a trick on subsequent editors. Their mandate was for us to be a magazine of the American idea, but they didn't define this idea. They left it for each generation of Atlantic journalists to figure out the puzzle of America for themselves. One way we do that is through this festival. It's my belief, and this is the baker praising his own bread, so some skepticism on your part is fine. It's my belief, though, that our journalism has become indispensable for our many millions of readers, particularly during the last several years, which, I don't have to tell you, have been both tumultuous and disconcerting. What you'll see this week is our journalism coming to life. We'll be talking to visionaries and challenging political leaders and asking hard questions of the companies that are shaping modern life. We've got a full day and a full week of virtual programming ahead of us. There's a comprehensive schedule in the event platform, but I'd like to especially highlight our main Idea Stage interviews, which begin at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So let's get started.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jean Meserve, an Atlantic contributor. Welcome to the Atlantic Festival. We are so glad to have you here. America's business leaders are using their voice, their influence, and their reach to drive global change. Over the next hour, we're going to take a look at what corporate responsibility looks like in 2021. We're going to talk about the balance between purpose and profit. And we're going to take a look at the coalitions that the private sector is building in order to create a more equitable society for all. A couple of notes before we begin. First, a big thank you to our underwriter, U.S. Bank, for their support of the Atlantic Festival and our journalism here at the Atlantic. And also to all of you, we would love your participation. Please use the Q&A tab on your screen. Please tell us where you're from, submit your question, and we will work them into the conversation. And now, let's get going. For A View from the C-Suite, please welcome Les Brun, co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Ariel Alternatives. Derek Thompson, a staff writer at The Atlantic, is here to lead the conversation.
Les, thank you so much for joining us today. First question, we seem to be in a moment, thank you. We seem to be in a moment when corporate executives are more willing to talk about social justice. I am interested in your theory of what changed. I feel like there used to be a very bright line between business and politics, but I see more and more CEOs and business leaders taking political stands. What do you think is behind this change? And do you see it more as a gradual evolution, or was there some sharp inflection point that you can point to?
That's a great question. I'm not sure that there is a sharp point I could point to, with the exception of the murder of George Floyd back in May of a year and a half ago now. But there's certainly been a void in the political spectrum that the business community has seemed to step into. And that's part and parcel of what's going on now with respect to social change.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that the void in the political system is playing a huge role here, that somehow it's as if without Washington acting to solve all these problems, the activist energies that existed among millennials, but among some business leaders as well, was essentially funneled into the private sector. I wonder what you think about the difference between companies speaking up for social justice and companies having policies that actually address social justice. It's so easy to put up a square on Instagram or to send out a tweet that quotes a civil rights leader favorably. It's much harder to change policy, change supply chain, change hiring and promotion policy. So how do you look at the distinction now that more companies are getting into the social justice world? How do you think about this distinction between those that talk the talk and those that are walking the walk?
That's another great question. I think those that walk the walk are the ones that recognize that the world is evolving as we speak. Their customers are different, their employees are different, they're much more mission driven, much more socially conscious, and enterprise needs to acknowledge that in order to be the success of the future. I think as we go out the timeline, we'll see an increasing focus on the social dynamic of ESG, as it's commonly come to be referred to. And that's going to be driven by the desire of enterprise to actually live up to the claims that they've made about their desire to be part of the solution to the wealth inequity problem and to other social issues that exist in the United States today.
2 points in that last answer. Can you unpack what ESG is and what it means? And can you also maybe give an example of a company that you look to that maybe has either changed its policy in the last few years or has over the last few years sort of gone from being, 1 foot in the social justice world to being fully in?
Yeah, so ESG means different things to different people, as it always has. I think that there is a body of data that is growing towards a consensus to the meaning of both E, S, and G, but still there is no absolute answer to what that means. In terms of companies that have lived the talk, I think of Merck as an example of that, which I was part of for quite some time, having been privileged to be on the board of Merck for a long period of time. And there's an enterprise that has focused on how it looks at the world from an S perspective, as well as E and G, but certainly the S perspective in terms of pay equity, in terms of gender diversification, in terms of ethnic diversification, and has put into place processes and procedures that speak to address those issues and needs.
Yeah, your Project Black co-founder, Melody Hobson, was quoted as saying, corporate America has learned very quickly that social unrest and economic inequality are bad for business. I thought this was a really interesting quote because I think there was an idea, a pernicious idea, but very much an idea, just a few years ago, that inequality was good for business, that low wages and rising equity was a defining feature of the economy for many years. And there was this lots of discussion. I remember especially in the early and mid 2010, when people looking at the economy, when analysts or macroeconomists were looking at the economy, they said, well, look, one reason why stocks are rising are actually that there is so little wage growth, right? So inequality was good for business in a way. So make the argument that economic inequality is bad for business. Why should we believe that?
So economic inequality is bad for business because what drives business growth is consumption. And in order to consume, you have to have the means to consume. If you don't have the means to consume, you don't, and business doesn't grow. And so the extent to which you can provide incremental consumption capability to an otherwise underserved community, you are advantaging the enterprise longer term. I think businesses have recognized that that's number one in terms of the sort of pure economic driven growth and good for business concept. But I also think businesses become aware of the fact that the world is changing and that both their employee base, their customer base, and all other stakeholders are increasingly more mission driven, socially conscious, and have a set of requirements that far exceed just making a good product, but how it is you live your life as a corporate citizen that drives the demand for your goods and services.
I wonder whether you feel like it's become easier to make that argument to companies. I feel like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we really were in a very different place when it came to these theories of equity and equality, consumption, exactly what you're talking about right now. I mean, in a way, the argument that you're making is sort of an old-fashioned Keynesian argument that what we need is adequate demand, and adequate demand will drive business wealth. I just remember a time when things were very different. Has it become easier to make that argument that economics starts with demand, it starts with consumption, it starts with the individual, and as a result, we have to think about economics through this lens of equality and not just allow inequality to run rampant?
Yeah, I would say, you know, it's a relative term, right? So it's become easier. It's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
There is still a very much of an old guard in business that has a much more conventional, this is the way we've always done it, this has always worked, why change it, why fix it if it ain't broke kind of mentality.
Mm-hmm.
And those, I think, will be the enterprises that 20 years from now we'll be speaking of as, remember that company that existed back 20 years ago, as opposed to the companies that will survive into the future and brave that brave new world, right? We live in a world now where the demand for talent, if you think about what's happened to our economy in terms of what is attractive to consume, it's services as opposed to products, generally speaking, increasingly so. And as a consequence, you need to be able to attract talent to deliver those services. That talent has a number of requirements for it to be attracted to your enterprise. Among that being a social consciousness that addresses what that talent believes are important issues to them in the current environment and as they look towards the future. You're not hiring, workers to be on the manufacturing line anymore. You're hiring engineers, you're hiring developers, you're hiring a level of talent that has a very different demand dynamic than it did previously.
Right. And I think rising social consciousness among corporations is definitely a positive trend. On the negative side, there is the wealth equality gap in America, especially the wealth equality gap between ethnicities. Talk a little bit about how the pandemic exposed or exacerbated those gaps and the structural biases that lead to them.
Well, certainly I'm no expert, Derek, but I mean, it was pretty patently clear to anyone who was observing the dynamics during the height of the pandemic that there was a tremendous inequality between those who were exposed on the front line and their wealth relative to those who were not so exposed because they had the wealth with which to fight the pandemic or to hide from the pandemic in certain ways. Mm-hmm. Clearly, if you think about Black and white wealth inequality, the average white male's got a $91 or so thousand net worth. The average white woman's got somewhere around $88,000, $89,000. Average Black male has $29,000 of net worth, and the average Black woman, which is even worse, is probably a little less than $10,000. So that inequality has just grown over time. It hasn't gotten better over the years. And it's at long last a time where we can begin to address that. And I think one of the ways that we want to address that is by what we're doing with Project Black in terms of creating some businesses that can begin to bring up the talent pool, reduce wage inequality, create jobs in communities of need, put facilities in communities that are desperate for revitalization. And so we're really excited about what we're doing with Project Black in that regard.
Yeah, take a half step back and tell me a little bit more about Project Black, what it is and why it was conceived.
So it's the result of some thinking that Melody and I and a couple of others were doing over the course of the time subsequent to the George Floyd murder. And Melody had a conversation with Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, which led to the creation of Project Black. And the Project Black name is Melody's ideation, and it's stuck. And as a consequence, we are calling it that going forward. And it really is designed to take advantage of the speaking of large corporates in their desire to expand their spend with diverse suppliers, and the fact that they've been unable thus far to actually achieve anywhere near that spend, given that the vast majority of minority suppliers or minority enterprises are of such small scale. And so we concluded that we could bridge that gap by acquiring enterprises that were majority owned as they sat today, that we could effectively minoritize by increasing the minority participation in the C-suite, increasing board diversification, increasing the common equity ownership, and using those tools to drive down through the entirety of the employee stack growth in job and wealth creation amongst the minority community. We think it's an idea whose time has come. We think the response from corporate America in terms of their interest in what we're doing suggests it's an idea whose time has come. We're sort of perplexed as why no one had done it before. It doesn't seem that complex an idea, but we're delighted to be the first mover in that regard and looking fully to exploit that opportunity to the benefit of both the Black and Brown communities, Black Latinx communities, but equally to benefit corporations in their desire to achieve their stated goals.
Yeah, can you pick a concrete example of how Project Black would work? Pick a specific industry whose supply chain you would want to reorient financing toward minority owners?
So I want to disabuse you of the supply chain piece for a moment and think about it more broadly in the context of procurement as large enterprises think of it. So yes, there's a supply chain in terms of the materials and products and intermediate products and services that you need to go into building whatever you're making or selling. But there's also the overall corporate need in terms of infrastructure, in terms of health services for all of its employees, payroll. So take your pick of all of the infrastructure needs that an organization has in order to produce what it produces through its supply chain, right, and think of that as procurement. We're interested in positioning companies that can take advantage of that procurement spend and position themselves as credible tier one, best in class or first in class suppliers of that product or service, right? That will be minority owned, that can grow because of the increasing demand of large corporates to buy from minority suppliers, particularly if they're producing first or best in class products or services, that will allow then for jobs to be created in communities of need and for new facilities to be placed in communities of need. So concrete
and what
example,
does success look like? Go ahead. Yeah, sorry, go right ahead.
No. I love what success looks like. So success will look different depending on the industry, but generally speaking, broadly speaking, success will look like being able to position and create multiple billion-dollar suppliers that are minority owned to Fortune 500s that have created, at least as we think about it over the next decade, 100,000 new jobs. Now, we think about them in terms of jobs, but also in terms of careers, because it's not just about increasing wages or creating a wage-creating opportunity, but also increasing wealth. And so when we think about how it is we're going to use our platform to position our companies for success and what that success looks like, it could mean helping Black and Latinx folks figure out a way to finance their kids' college education without dipping into their 401k. It could mean creating opportunities for them to save a little bit more rather than going through the pernicious payday lender scheme. It could mean any number of things that are sort of taken for granted today that affect meaningfully Black and Latinx communities that we're going to be focusing on.
Right. And you said this is clearly an idea whose time has come. Have you encountered any resistance to this idea as you've gone out and talked about it with different corporations? Has there been any kind of pushback?
Derek, what a great question. Yeah, absolutely, there has been pushback. And it's not, oddly enough, I don't think it's necessarily malicious pushback. It's the pushback of conventional thinking. It's the pushback of inherently held ideas of where people fit into a spectrum that's held it back. So we're literally trying to break a convention. We're trying to change thinking completely in terms of getting people to focus on the fact that Black and Latinx doesn't mean small. It doesn't mean janitorial services. It doesn't mean, producing tray liners for McDonald's. It can mean being smack in the middle of value-added products and services, tech-enabled, that large corporate America needs and uses daily, that can be provided by Black and Latinx-owned companies.
That's fantastic. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Les, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Hey, enjoyed it. Thanks so much, Derek. Appreciate you allowing me to be on. Thanks.
Thank you.
For a session produced by our underwriter, U.S. Bank, Access Commitment Approach to Addressing the Racial Wealth Gap. Please welcome Greg Cunningham, Chief Diversity Officer of U.S. Bank.
I'm a proud product of the late 60s. My dad was a small business owner, and I remember very vividly when Dr. King was assassinated that our city, growing up in Pittsburgh, our cities, our communities all became destabilized. And I remember my dad's business being looted and burned at that time. I remember writing the sign with him saying owned by a soul brother, so we could put the sign in the window so they wouldn't burn down our business. I remember my dad going to a large bank to get a loan to reopen his business. And of course, being a black man in the late 60s, no bank was going to give him a loan. This is not the first time where, as a country, we've gone through this sort of racial reckoning and awakening. George Floyd was killed right here in Minneapolis, just blocks from our office and where we're sitting today. And being able to do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion for me is so that there's some little kid out there right now who's going through that same sense of anxiety, that same sense of, what does this all mean for me? What does it mean for my future? Does anybody care? Does anybody see me and hear me? This work of DEI is to ensure that every single kid in our country sees themselves, feels that they have value, and feels that their life matters. That's what this work is about. How do we move to a more dynamic future? And I think that's the secret sauce. I think that's what people really want to understand, is how do we move forward together? It's important to understand the history and where we came from, and to look at that history through the lens of inclusion in a much more honest way than we typically have. We as a bank see the work that we do, how our activities are actually serving our purpose as an organization, and ensuring that our purpose is true for every single one of our stakeholders. We're seeing leaders become far more empathetic. We're seeing businesses begin to think about how inclusion is an integral part of their business strategy. And that's what's happening at U.S. Bank. The launch of the Access Commitment, which we launched back in February. And the Access Commitment really serves to do three things. One, to help catalyze equity for communities and families. It seeks to create greater access for small businesses, and it seeks to create greater equitable opportunities for employees. What's important about that work is every single one of our senior leaders on the managing committee, every single business line in our organization is involved in that work. And it's a really good example of how we've created new systems for collaboration, new partnerships, and really begun to integrate this notion of equity and inclusion as part of our business strategy.
It's really important for us to have diversity at every level within the organization. Our customers are diverse. Our customers are increasingly diverse, and we need those lived experiences at the leadership roles where the strategic decisions are being made.
Our core purpose is investing our hearts and our minds to propel human potential. And how do we propel human potential if we don't have leaders of color in senior leaderships, if we don't have people of color in senior leadership?
So by investing in the people who are misrepresented in your corporation and diversifying your workforce, you're only helping the bottom line.
To build a relationship with your customers that are diverse, you have to make sure you have a communication model and individuals who really exemplify the customer of the future. And so I think now more than ever, big institutions like small businesses need to realize that we need each other, and that culture plus capacity. A big bank needs somebody in culture that can help translate the language to the new customer, and the new customer needs a translator to understand how banks work. And I think we're at a place where we need each other equal.
The Wednesday, following the murder of George Floyd, I had a call from my customer saying that my branch is getting broken into. So drove up there, and little did I know, took a look at the branch, and it was totally destroyed. I wanted our rebuild, not only a rebuild, but follow the message from our CEO where he says we want to be engaged with our community. We want our community to be a part of our banking. So the outcome was amazing. The finished product was amazing. It's a modern branch with the latest technology in the future of banking and where we're going. We're not only here in the community to do business, but we care. And we're giving you some of the best technology. We're giving you some of the best outlines to do what you need to do to get where you need to be financially.
When I say U.S. Bank has surrounded me with a great team of people, I mean that from the bottom of my heart. We're just elated that you guys are doing this. You know, there's not many banks that would do what we're getting, and there's not a lot of people in my community being surrounded by people that actually care, by people that are actually helping my business grow. It is huge for us.
One of the persistent problems that we recognized very early on in our work was the racial wealth gap. As we thought about being a bank, how we could make a real difference in social justice and in the advancement of communities, we realized that one of the places we could apply our core competency was to the racial wealth gap, which today currently stands at 8-to-1, meaning black households have 1/8 the wealth of white households in this country. And that's not a black problem, that's an American problem. These racial wealth disparities actually impact every single one of us as Americans. It's a drag on the U.S. economy as a whole. And it actually is a drag on the household income of every single American household. So it's in all of our best interests to see us close those gaps so that we can all reach our full potential. So we're actually going to take a number of our business bankers of color, black business bankers in our organization, and we're going to pair them up with wealth advisors who will be their mentors over a period of time so that they can ultimately become wealth advisors. You know, there's an incredible trust gap between communities of color and the black community specifically and the financial industry. And that mistrust is well earned. There's over 400 years of reasons why there's mistrust. And so in order to close that trust gap, we need to make sure that we're taking some of these young business bankers and actually training them to be that sense of truth and that source of understanding for our clients. The second thing we're really proud to launch, this initiative around increasing home ownership in the black community is really critical. If we have coaches and people from the community who are in the branches, who understand the needs of the customers, it'll really sort of provide a different level of confidence, of credibility, and trust that we think is going to be absolutely critical. So what we're doing to actually hold ourselves accountable is we've actually partnered with a national research institute, the Urban Institute, to help us build a measurement framework so that we can actually measure the outcomes, that we can understand how our investments have actually changed communities, that we're actually driving results. What I've discovered in doing this work is there's lots of people individually doing good work. The challenge is how do we do great work together? And for U.S. Bank, what that's meant for us is really thinking about our core competency and applying that core competency to these larger issues.
For a session on new approaches to inclusion, I'm joined by Craig Robinson, EVP and Chief Diversity Officer at NBC Universal, and Rosa Rodriguez-Williams, Senior Director of Belonging and Inclusion at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston.
Craig and Rosa, great to have you both here with us. A lot of organizations have responded to the current moment by appointing diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, and I want to talk some about the success or challenges to changing culture and creating a truly inclusive environment. Craig, I want to start with you. You've been in your current job for 10 years, but you have said in the past that your entire career has involved work on diversity, equity, and inclusion because you're a member of an underrepresented population. Explain to us what you mean.
Great, thank you. Hi, good morning, and nice to see you again, Rosa, as well. It's something I've given a great deal of thought to. I'm a member of a number of underrepresented groups, and when I speak about, when I've made that comment in the past, I think that I'm just trying to put a point on the fact that all of us, women, members of the LGBTQ community, people of color, members of the disabilities community, live with this every day. So when we bring ourselves to work every day, we are doing that work whether we know it or not. Helping people understand that we are entitled to equity, helping people understand that we are as capable as they are, and helping to break down some of the biases that they may be bringing. So while I'm doing it now formally, I think we're all doing it informally every day without realizing it when we're members of those communities.
Rosa, as I mentioned, Craig has been on the job for 10 years. You are in a newly created position at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Talk to us a little bit about the events that spurred the creation of your position.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, and good morning to you, Greg, as well. Nice to see you. Also, happy Latinx, Latino, Hispanic Heritage Month to all my Latinos out there. Just wanted to sort of share that with folks. But I think, you know, at the MFA, being the first anywhere is really difficult, right? And I think, you know, a lot of folks believe that my position was created as part of sort of the uprising and the murder of George Floyd. And actually, this position was part of the strategic plan when Matthew Teitelbaum came to the museum, and it created several positions, one being the Senior Director of Belonging and Inclusion, because we were taking and seeing that the museum needed to create a better relationship with the community, more visitor-centered experience for BIPOC and marginalized communities. And you know, the position was created to work across the museum with other offices. And so, you know, I spent the last year just sort of on a listening tour assessing what is, you know, I come from higher ed. I've been doing this work for a little bit on that level. And I, you know, am just sort of feeling out what it is to do this work within a museum.
There was a specific episode, Rosa, that involved a school group visiting the museum, which sparked tremendous uproar in Boston. Do you feel the museum has moved past that yet?
I think we are working through that. You know, when the incident with Davis Leadership Academy occurred, it was before my time. You know, I'm a parent to a young Black and Latino young man. I am from the inner city, Lawrence, Massachusetts. And so, you know, these spaces, a lot of the time for us, do not feel welcoming. And, you know, I think a lot of us, when we enter these spaces, we're taking risks, right? And so when you enter the space, and have sort of this experience, it's traumatic to those who are part of it, who are experiencing it. It's just a really horrible and terrible incident to be part of. I know that the museum at the time, you know, acted swiftly, and they banned sort of the patrons that were part of the incident. They investigated, and along with the Attorney General's office, created the Memorandum of Understanding, and that was drafted in March 2020. Finalized in April 2020, and COVID hit. So when the emergency orders were in place, you know, we sort of continued to do the work informally. Now that the emergency order is sort of lifted, we have about 120 days, which brings us to October 15th to start working directly with Davis Leadership Academy and you know, figure out sort of how best to use the $500,000 that was promised as part of the Memorandum of Understanding.
Craig, Comcast announced a plan to allocate, I think it was $100 million to injustice and equality and to promote DEI efforts. What is the one initiative underway right now which you think has really made a difference?
Boy, it is very, very hard to choose. I would say that actually the one initiative that is separate from the $100 million that I would focus on, that I think has been such a change for our company culturally, is something that we're doing called Meet the Moment, which came out of the desire that we heard from our employees to be educated on these issues. We heard from our white employees, we heard from our black employees, we heard from our Hispanic employees. Everyone said to us, please enable us, give us the tools to have a common lexicon, to be able to speak about what can be very sensitive issues to each other, because that was clearly a problem that we all realized coming out of the events of last year. So we are now about to have our fourth session. They are company-wide at the same time. Comcast does a version, we do a version that we drop at the same time for all 35,000 of our employees. And we are educating people on unconscious bias, on microaggressions, on how to create an environment at work that is culturally inclusive, and how to speak to your coworkers about issues that are complicated and sometimes quite provocative.
Craig, as you mentioned, that is a company-wide effort, but I'm wondering if in other instances you find that different silos react different ways, and something that might work for sports might not work for sales, for example. Have you had to customize some of your programming to be very specific?
Well, one of the things that the company did that was a realization, and I'm happy to say not part of the 100 million, on top of the 100 million, is that over the past year, despite it being a challenging year for many businesses, we gave, the company provided resources within about, I believe, 4 or 5 of our businesses that didn't exist previously in senior DEI leaders. So to your point, we have a brand new senior vice president of DEI in sports, a brand new VP in sales, a brand new SVP in our news area, a brand new SVP in our stations group, because exactly as you said, not every solution works the same for every business. And I'm in the corporate role, but I kept saying to people, I don't know the ins and outs of what's going to work. So instead of me continuing to give ideas that people say, that's not really how it works here, let's put people in the business that wake up every day, are thinking about it every day, and are creating these tailored, customized solutions. And we've really seen progress in a short amount of time based on that.
Rosa, you have a multi-tiered challenge. You are looking at your exhibitions, you're looking at your visitors, you're looking at staff, you're dealing with artists. Is there one initiative that you could point to that you think is really moving the needle?
Yeah, I think a lot of the work, especially outward-facing initiatives that happened when I started there, with our artists in residence and the mural projects that were happening, and we had Basquiat as an exhibition, which drew a lot of public programs that brought a lot of folks that usually don't come to the museum, and so those initiatives were really great to bringing people in. I think when you look at the museum and when you look at this work really, and based on sort of my experience and leading practice, um, uh, you know, when an organization's DIA model focuses solely on programs or solely on compliance, or training or people manage independent of each other, these models tend to sort of fall short. They may help in 1 or 2 spaces, but they don't take a comprehensive sort of view of the organization. Therefore, usually will not achieve systemic and sustainable change. So I think, my work, it's so multi-leveled, and in terms of, what is our, what are we doing with our collection strategy? Is it diverse? What are we missing? How are our curators sort of really prioritizing the work, and the acquisition of work? And how are we using sort of the Heritage Fund that is for that, right? How are we reaching out to public programs, through public programs to the community, but also curating space where, there's inclusive language and there's a welcome and our labels are inclusive and our artwork is inclusive. And so, yes, it is multi-tiered. I think that's one of the reasons it's taken me sort of a little bit to sort of get my feet wet, because, in DIA, you sort of have these principles that you bring in the door, but as you said, Craig, everything looks different in every single department. And so together we're creating this strategic plan. We are figuring out our readiness, and then we're launching.
I'm wondering, and this is a question for both of you, if you have the support you need within your organizations, if you truly have power, or if this is just performative. Craig, you first.
Well, to go back to the way you opened the session, I'm so glad that you gave me the opportunity to provide the data point that, as you said, I've been in this job for 10 years, but I'm the second Chief Diversity Officer for the company. So there was someone, I had a predecessor who also reported to the CEO. So many companies are now responding to the moment. I know that Rosa, I'm so happy to hear that it wasn't about the moment, there was a longer term strategic plan. But we have had this position in place for 14 years, reporting to the CEO. And I think that that is something I speak about so often. Having the role with a direct line to the person, to the number one person in the company, provides the seat for me to be able to have the power that I need, and also sends such an important message to the entire company that it is important to him or her, the CEO, that this Chief Diversity Officer has a direct line to them.
Rosa, do you feel you have the power you need?
I think so. You know, I have working directly with Matthew Teitelbaum, who is the director of the museum, working with consultants that were put in place prior to me entering into the position. And so a lot of sort of the cultural assessment work has happened. As I said, we're launching a strategic plan that we just finalized. And Matthew was part of that process. He rolled up his sleeves and he has unequivocally shared with our staff that this work will be done. And so I'm also happy to say that our board of trustees has an IDA strategic plan that they're about to roll out as well. And so I think, like many organizations, the MFA is rising up to the present moment. Yes, it was a position and initiative that was already in the works, but I think, like many companies, it's time for change, and folks are sort of rolling up their sleeves and really putting forth the effort and the work and the commitment.
Craig, obviously NBC Universal is a profit-driven company. Is that compatible with being a purpose-driven company?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of your previous speakers was talking about that. There is the absolute realization that these are not these are not two differing goals, and that for so many reasons, our viewers, our employees, and the world at large expects this. So one must be purpose-driven to also continue to be profitable. I think that the gentleman said earlier that the time has come that these are not mutually exclusive goals.
How do you measure your success? Craig, you said earlier you were successful. How do you know that?
Well, we measure everything. We track in front of and behind the camera diversity. We track that in our workforce. We track it in our supplier diversity. One of the first things that I did when I came into the position, and I was told was one of the most important things, was I had to know where we were in order to know if we're going to get better. And that is the first, most basic, most cliched lesson I think that anyone who does this work learns. How do you know that you are progressing unless you know where you started? And also, that is a tool that we use in DEI, because you can't count on people's goodwill always to do this work. You have to bring them the data. So when you come and say, pardon me, here is the number today, here was the number 2 years ago, we've actually gone backwards. What are we going to do about it? That's an undeniable thing, because you're dealing with business leaders, and business leaders are accustomed to metrics. So that's how we know, because we measure absolutely everything.
Rosa, are you also measuring? Do you know what to measure?
Yeah, you know, we're starting to benchmark. As I said, we did our cultural assessment. But I think, you know, I'm working with the Boston College School of Social Work, because I think belonging is sort of that subjective kind of metric, right? That, one day you can feel like you belong somewhere and sometimes you don't. But in terms of hard numbers and diversity, we are measuring those things, thinking about, how have we embedded inclusion practice into our exhibition process, and have our collection strategies changed, and our interpretation practices, are they more inclusive in the language that it's using, and the stories and the narratives that are being told, are they less Eurocentric, or are they still the same? This is an 150-year-old institution that if that it was sort of created to be exclusive, right? And so we must start to really look at how we have practiced before and sort of benchmark that and make steps towards where we're headed. I think a lot of organizations sort of put out these statements for Black Lives Matter and solidarity to sort of the uprising that happened last summer. And so, I think the gap that is to measure is sort of what that vision of that statement was and what the actual culture of the institution is. And sort of that gap in the middle is where you strategize and you're tactical about, and then you measure those things. And so that's the game that we're in, right? We're just starting to get those things done.
Greg, is this work ever done?
No, of course not. And you hear so many chief diversity officers say, "Oh, my goal is to work myself out of a job." Again, I think that's
not yours, I gather.
I think that sounds like a fun, pithy quote to get pulled out from a talk. But as the gentleman earlier said, we're talking about 400 years of inequality. I think it is incredibly optimistic and perhaps unrealistic to think that there will ever be true equality. Now, I don't know what things will look like 1,000 years from now, but certainly 100 years from now, we are going to be facing some of these very same issues. They are so deeply, deeply embedded in our society. So this notion that a few programs or $100 million or $20 billion can help solve it is something to aspire to, but I think that we need to be realistic, because if we're realistic, we will double down on our efforts. And I just want to come back to something you just said, Rosa, which is amazing. You said that your organization was created to be exclusive. I think that is so brave to say, and just acknowledging that is such a recognition that they have the right person in the job to make a change. And then I want to do one more plug for NBC Universal. When you talk about belonging, when you said, how do we know we're making progress? We survey our employees every other year, and we added more DEI questions this year than ever. And after this year, we were concerned about what employees were going to feel at the workplace. Was enough being done? Did they feel that our promises were performative or hollow? And 89% of our employees said that they felt that DEI was important at NBC Universal. Almost 9 out of 10. That meant a lot, because at a time when people are understandably more cynical and more apprehensive than ever, that is what our employees said.
And we have to leave it there. Craig and Rosa, thank you both so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rosa.
Thank you, Craig.
For a discussion about investing in community impact, please welcome Saida Agostini-Bostic, President of Funders for LGBTQ Issues, John Banner, President of the PepsiCo Foundation, Jacquelline Fuller, President of Google.org. Derek Thompson is back to lead the conversation.
Hello and welcome. Jacquelline, let's start with you. At Google.org, Google's philanthropic institution, you call philanthropy society's risk capital. What does that mean? What does society's risk capital refer to?
Well, look, if we want to be serious about impact, we have to think very carefully about what can philanthropy do, and how can each of us who are part of this globally as a community do what we're uniquely good at and show up in a very real way, where we're bringing the best of our resources. So, at Google, for us as a tech company, that means we're going to invest more than $1 billion in nonprofits who are on the front lines in helping our network of partners. And we're also going to send ourselves, our tech experts, our Googlers, and embed them full time in our partners and for 6 months, a year, so that they can help build out the tools. So we've got to think about what can philanthropic capital do? We're a relatively small part of the equation, 25 billion maybe in the US in philanthropy. So thinking for corporates especially, the engines of change are going to be governments and markets. So how do we de-risk investments? How do we get out there and take those informed risks, apply that technology, bring our best, and then when we're successful, how do we then partner so we can hand that baton and scale these and actually drive systemic change?
John, similar question to you. If Google sees its comparative advantage as being technology, and it says if we're going to have a philanthropic arm, we should exercise our comparative advantage, which is technology, in that philanthropic arm, how does PepsiCo see this? Where do you see the gaps and opportunities that a company like PepsiCo can lend itself when it comes to philanthropy?
Thanks, Derek. It's great to be with you and with all of you today. We're in about 200 countries around the world. We have almost 300,000 employees, and we like to think of ourselves as a multi-local company. And there's a very simple reason for that. We hire locally in all our markets. We source our ingredients and our supplies locally in almost all our markets. So we want to be part of that local fabric, and that's what makes us and the philanthropic efforts on behalf of PepsiCo and the company much more part of the local community. We've just launched a big local volunteering initiative across all 300,000 of our employees, starting in Asia and the US later this fall. And I think that's where we feel we can catalyze impact by working with our partners, and partnership and being local is key. I think two key learnings out of the pandemic that we're driving forward this year and into the future.
Saida, with you, what does your research show are the best ways to help the LGBTQ community? Where is your work most needed according to the research that you do?
Sure. And also, thank you so much for having us here. It really is a pleasure. For us, research is really a central part of our practice in terms of understanding what is the scale of LGBTQ giving in the United States, and also what do we need to do to actually increase and expand philanthropic giving. And for us, what feels tremendously concerning is that while in 2018, we witnessed more dedicated funds going to LGBTQ communities than ever before. In real terms, only 28 cents out of every single dollar went to LGBTQ communities, which for us really begs the question about how is it philanthropy is really understanding the needs of LGBTQ folks, and what is it we can do as a philanthropic support organization to ensure that funders and corporations really understand and follow the wisdom of movement leaders on the ground who are doing the work.
Great. Okay, so I think we have the theory on the table. Let's get into some of the specifics. Jacquelline, give me an example of Google.org using the technology that you talked about in order to do something really fantastic in the world. What's a great test case for the idea that Google can walk into this already very crowded philanthropic charitable world and really make an impact?
Let me start just picking up on what Saida was saying. Absolutely right. LGBTQ community. How can we all show up and be better as funders and more distinctive? So as Google, one thing that we've done is partnered with the Trevor Project. So super important work they're doing to ensure that especially young people in the LGBTQ community have a resource online where they can go, especially when in crisis. But we needed to help them to expand their ability to respond to the overwhelming need, which, as you can imagine, grew even more so during COVID. So what we did is we invested about $3 million, giving them the resources that they need, but we sent 30 Googlers tech experts, our fellows, to work side by side with the Trevor Project. And they actually deployed a crisis counselor training tool that uses AI, natural language processing, to help make sure that we can get more of those counselors online and ready and working with our youth. So I think that's one example where the real heroes are the Trevor Project, the people who are doing this work, but we can come alongside and ask them, what do you need? How can we be the best partners? And send our resources and also send our Googlers.
Right. John, similar question to you. How do you take this multi-local perspective, as I think you described it, and do something real and do something useful? Give me an example of a project that you're particularly proud of.
Yeah, I think, in the aftermath of not only COVID, but the George Floyd murder, I think we found ourselves hyper aware of the disparities within the U.S. And those disparities are really very locally relevant, depending on the community and what needs are. And so we've worked with the National Urban League and Hispanic CFDI partners to really devote $20 million to helping 1,000 Black and Hispanic small businesses and restaurants over the next 5 years recover from both the lack of access to capital and also the sort of aftermath of the COVID economic shutdown. And that's by finding those partners. National Urban League, for instance, has associates and offices in all these communities, and they know what the needs are. So by partnering with them and allowing an application process that's seamless and digital first, really conveys the local nature of what we're trying to do, both from a philanthropic perspective and from a business perspective, which is all part of our racial equality journey, which is almost a $600 million commitment over the next 5 years across 3 different areas: the community, which I just talked about, but leveraging our business relationships and increasing representation in the company. So I think when you look at multi-local, it depends on what the initiative is and then how we execute it, but it really relies on that partnership and becoming exceedingly local, hyper-local.
Yeah. Saida, Mackenzie Scott just made a $3 million gift to your organization. Tell me what that means to you and what you're thinking of doing with the money.
Sure. We are incredibly grateful for the gift and the model of giving that Mackenzie Scott is demonstrating, where she's really trusting recipients with general operating support. And yet, also at the same time, we really want to hold that as mega donors are really emerging within our country, we really want to invite folks to consider about what are the truths about our society and economy, where one person has so much power to influence policy and also the scope and impact of the nonprofit sector. For us, we're actually using that money to really lean more deeply into our mission in terms of expanding the resources that are going to LGBTQ communities and what it means for us to be in partnership with foundations, corporate giving, and other private donors that are really seeking to enter into new models of philanthropy that have been demonstrated throughout COVID-19. And when I speak about that, what I'm really speaking about is really releasing a lot of the restrictions that giving is coming with, and also really figuring out how is it we invest in the wisdoms and best practices that have been generated historically for centuries by LGBTQ organizers.
That's great. Saida, actually, could you give me an example of a project that you're particularly proud of as well?
Oh, sure. So one project that we're particularly proud of at Funders for LGBTQ Issues is out in the South. Out in the South, in response to Hurricane Ida, worked with the Southern Power Fund to move about $5 million in 5 days to survivors of Hurricane Ida on the ground in the South. And so for us, what that means in real terms is that we had folks that were able to access hotel rooms, were able to get food, access to transportation, items to protect themselves from COVID-19. This is the kind of model of giving that we really want to champion, where we're trusting in the wisdom of LGBTQ organizers, where we're trusting in the wisdoms of folks that are creating mutual aid processes on the ground that know intimately what their community needs and needs funders to trust and have grace for those processes.
I have a question for the whole group, and we'll go individually for the answers. But I'm interested in how you think philanthropy is changing. Not only do we have changes in culture and society with COVID and I think new perspectives that corporations have with regard to social justice after the murder of George Floyd, but also I feel like companies are being more quantitative about their approach to philanthropy. They demand data, and the people who have gifts to these philanthropic organizations are doing so with a bit more of a data-oriented perspective. Starting with you, Jacquelline, tell me how you see sort of the ethos around philanthropy shifting in the last few years, if indeed my hypothesis is right, and this shift is indeed ongoing.
Yeah, as you can imagine, at Google, we care a lot about data, and we measure and we look for real evidence of impact. And so I think one of the changes that we're seeing across philanthropy is that we're willing to invest more in our partners and in our grantees, because oftentimes the funders are the problem, because we are not giving the resources necessary for folks to do quality M&E measurement and evaluation and then share out the results. We all have to get better about sharing our failures as well, because it's about building out the ecosystem. So one of the things that we are trying to hold ourselves accountable to, for example, is for job skills, let's say. I mean, jobs and getting folks who want the skills to help them increase their wages, for example, to have that available. All right, well, then let's not just look and measure, well, how many people did we train? Because we do get exciting numbers. You know, Google's trained 50 million people worldwide. But let's also look at, all right, what are the real wage gains there? And how are we, for example, working with the hardest hit, most marginalized community, the most vulnerable folks? So, for example, we know with job loss and with COVID, women were twice as likely globally to be impacted and lose a job. So how are we doing specifically with women? How are we doing specifically with communities of color? We know, for example, that communities of color in the US were disproportionately impacted even before COVID. COVID just made it worse. So we have to hold ourselves accountable as funders to make sure that we're funding the organizations who are led by people with lived experience, who have trust in the communities, and then that we measure together, and then we fund a success out of that.
John, Saida, 60 seconds to each of you. Do you buy this idea that there are changes that are roiling the way that we think about philanthropy, and that they're getting more quantitative, and there's more demand for hard data that comes out of the projects you engage in? John, we'll start with you, and finally Saida.
Yeah, I would say, just to echo what Jacqueline said, I think some of the disparities that were laid bare in the pandemic and in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder have long existed. And there was a renewed effort. And I think the demands on philanthropies and companies are greatly increasing as a result of those. And how we become more data driven in the outcomes to support those communities in need globally is a key part of, I think, the one way that the sort of industry and the sector of philanthropy is changing. I think we have to be more flexible in how we're granting money. We need to be more agile, and I think we need to expand the scope of what, and that's happened over the last year and a half, of what people are giving. And then finally, I think, just to echo the point, I think we need to be more local. We supported over 250 local partners in the last year to provide relief from the pandemic. So I think those sort of 3 or 4 things are the biggest changes in philanthropy going forward.
So I think when we talk about data and when we talk about evaluation, what we're actually talking about is power. And so I think what's really key in this moment to me is to understand who's actually creating the measures. So often when we look at evaluation data, the data that's being collected is being set by standards that are being set by foundations and corporate donors, as opposed to really inviting local communities and direct service providers to be asked, tell me, what is your vision? What is your vision of wellness and liberation for your community? And for us at Funders for LGBTQ Issues, it's really important for us to convene and create spaces where we're inviting corporations and donors to rethink how we're understanding data and what does success actually look like, and how are we creating spaces where communities are actually investing in data and research that mirrors their understanding of what wellness and freedom look like.
That's a great answer. Thank you all for your time. I really, really appreciate talking with you.
Thanks, Derek.
Thank you.
While we're on a break, we encourage you to network with other attendees and visit our expo booths. To participate, select the networking icon located on the left-hand side of the screen. Next, click Join, and you'll be randomly paired with another attendee for about 5 minutes. If you wish, you can exchange virtual information with each other and keep in contact via direct message within the platform. You can also click the Explore icon to visit our virtual expo booths. Here you can explore more resources from the Atlantic and our underwriters related to today's event. We'll see you shortly after the break.